Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Evoland. This is a game by Shiro Games that was released in 2013 for PC and Mac, and it's gone on to be released on many different systems subsequently, from Android and iOS on up to the PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. And of course what you're seeing here is the PC version, and these days you can get it as part of Evoland Legendary Edition, which is actually this game and its sequel bundled together all as one product, where the sequel is considerably more expansive and quite a lot longer than this one, so I'm not sure if that one's going to be a review or an MTO yet, but this one is an MTO because I could not bring myself to finish Evoland. A fact you may find surprising when you consider that this game is maybe 3 or 4 hours at absolute most. All told, I made it a bit under an hour and a half into the game, which means that I made it roughly to the halfway point of the game and just decided to stop playing because it wasn't really doing anything for me. Now that was not necessarily the case starting out, so let's go ahead and talk about what Evoland actually is and why I haven't talked about the presentation yet, even though this is about where I would start talking about it. You see, Evoland is actually a product of the Ludum Dare Game Jam competition for 2012, where the theme of that year was evolution, and the developer of this decided to take you through the history of what they deemed to be role-playing games, although I'd say that the developers used the term role-playing game extremely loosely in this game's case, because a lot of it is actually more like action-adventure games. And when the game starts out, it's actually pretty interesting because it starts out with monochrome 2D graphics and you can't even move more than one direction, and over time, as you continue to unlock new things, you are able to go to the full 2D perspective where you can move up, down, left, or right, and you also end up being able to convert the graphics over to color, and eventually get music and sound effects, because you don't even start with those, and eventually unlocking multiple different combat systems, as well as eventually 3D graphics, and it just continues to progress from there. Now, oddly enough, that means that the presentation is actually a major part of the gameplay because it dramatically affects the way the game actually plays as you continue throughout, and you will notice very quickly that it doesn't really dwell on one particular thing for a very long period of time, at least not until roughly the half-hour point. Because up until that point, it's changing things up quite frequently, and then finally when you get to that, it starts to settle into two camps, which are the Zelda-esque action-adventure style, and the JRPG style that was popularized by the likes of Dragon Quest and especially Final Fantasy. Those of you who aren't as familiar with those styles of gameplay will probably wonder why that's a particularly big problem. Well, here's the thing. The style that was popularized by The Legend of Zelda is a top-down action-adventure game, where it's all in real time and it's an action-based combat system and all that sort of thing. Meanwhile, the style that was popularized by Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy after it is a turn-based system, where your party stands in a straight line and takes turns whacking the enemy party in the face. They are pretty much the opposite ends of the gameplay spectrum. One of them is real-time and action-based, the other one is turn-based and is just clicking through a menu. And this brings me to my central problem with Evoland. The concept itself is actually quite interesting, taking you through the history of a genre and starting at the humble beginnings and going all the way up to the more modern styles all in the span of one game. That's actually really cool, and I like that they attempted that here. The problem is that they can't seem to decide which genre they actually want to take you through the history of. Because according to the blurb on Steam, it's a journey through the history of action-adventure gaming. And to that end, it starts out like you would pretty much expect, where it plays basically like The Legend of Zelda, which was one of the earlier examples of an action-adventure game. But then you get about 5 or so minutes into the game, and it stops playing like an action-adventure game in the style of Legend of Zelda, and it starts playing like Final Fantasy, which is not an action-adventure game. In fact, it's quite far removed from action-adventure games, so why they decided to go from action-adventure to JRPG, and then go back to action-adventure, and then go back to JRPG, and then somehow end up on Diablo clone by the point where I just stopped playing, I don't really know. You see, if this were actually the history of action-adventure games, then it would start with something like The Legend of Zelda, I'm talking, of course, the original Legend of Zelda, and then move on up into sort of the SNES era, doing pretty much the same thing. Then you would hit the 3D era, and it would be more along the lines of, say, Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask. Maybe have a bit of an aside where it's more of a hack-and-slash game like, say, God of War, and eventually you end up with something along the lines of, say, the Batman Arkham series, and eventually Ideally, of course, something along the lines of Uncharted or modern Tomb Raider or things like that. But that's not what Evoland actually does. It starts off with action-adventure, and then moves over into JRPG, and then back to action-adventure, and then back to JRPG, and then all of a sudden it starts playing like Diablo, which is bringing a third genre into the mix, and then it's back to JRPG and Zelda-style action-adventure for a bit before you finish the game. And the thing you have to remember about all of this is that this started life as a Game Jam title, which means that it was basically an experiment that was thrown together and was not particularly well refined by the time the contest finished, but it was an interesting concept and they went out to prove that the concept could work. When you take something like that and start trying to sell it, the expectation is that you're going to take what you did in that proof of concept, expand upon it, and fix and refine things so it's actually a fun, playable game. And while they certainly managed to nail the playable part of this, unfortunately they didn't nail the fun part, because the mechanics in this are the absolute bare bones needed to be functional and nothing more. When you're going through the real-time sequences, more often than not it's just a matter of moving around and whacking things with a sword, and that even extends to the bit where it plays more like a Diablo clone. You don't have any special abilities you can use, you just go around and whack things with a sword combo. Meanwhile, you go to the turn-based sequences, and you do have a couple of options, but even those are bare bones and limited to basically 2 options per character. And while some of the elements do stack on each other, it's more that they stack on each other within their own particular subsets. So the action-adventure stuff stacks on the other action-adventure stuff, but it doesn't carry over into the JRPG stuff. And by the same token, the JRPG stuff stacks on the other JRPG stuff, but does not stack on the action-adventure stuff. So all those level ups you're earning and all that sort of thing doesn't really matter once you move on to, say, the Diablo clone bit, where all of a sudden you have no equipment and you have to find a bunch of randomized loot. And because those multiple gameplay styles are so wildly opposed to one another, there's not really any way they could have made that actually work as a cohesive whole. Instead, it really does come across as something that's trying to be a nostalgia trip and nothing more. And the problem with trying to do that is that it only really works if you have that experience under your belt, and that experience was positive in the past. And here's the thing. For one of those genres, I do have very positive experiences from the past, which is action-adventure games. I've been a fan of the Legend of Zelda series for a very long time, and the one in particular that hooked me on that series was A Link to the Past, which remains my favorite game in the series to date. And A Link to the Past is very much that old school style of top-down action-adventure game. So Evoland started out pretty strong. And that lasts all of about 5 minutes before it changes over to the JRPG style of gameplay and stays with that for the next 15 or so minutes. Now I say that and you're probably thinking, oh, 15 minutes of that? That's not that bad, right? Let me fill you in on something that has come up before on the channel, but it's been quite a long time, so you may not be familiar with it. Out of all of the games that I have played over the years, there have been exactly 3 JRPGs that I have even come close to liking. The first of these is Tales of Phantasia, which was the very first game in the Tales series. The second of them is Chrono Trigger, and the third of them is Final Fantasy VI. And the reasons I like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI have absolutely nothing to do with the gameplay mechanics. In fact, those gameplay mechanics are the primary reason you don't see me reviewing a lot of JRPGs on my channel. I absolutely despise that style of turn-based combat, and more importantly, I despise the constant random encounters that goes along with it. And while I cut games from the 80s some slack in that regard because they were still figuring things out, by the time you hit the 90s, which is mostly what this particular game is emulating, they should have known better and should have known to try different things. And in fact, some studios did try different things. That's why the Tales series is considerably more interesting to play than the likes of Final Fantasy. Sure, they still had tons of random encounters, and sure, it still wasted a lot of the player's time, but it didn't waste the player's time like Final Fantasy did, where even within the turn-based combat, which is mind-numbingly tedious on its own, they had to go and make things worse by introducing the active time system, which wastes even more of your time than the basic turn-based combat of, say, Final Fantasy 1 and 2. And of course, that active time system is precisely what the developers of Evoland decided to implement in their turn-based sections. So not only do those turn-based sections have basically nothing to do with the history of action-adventure games, like they've advertised the game to be, ESRB, but in a misdirected sense of nostalgia for the likes of Final Fantasy VI and probably especially Final Fantasy VII, they've actually ended up putting arguably the worst turn-based combat system ever made into their game. It is a system that is inherently designed to waste the player's time, and if there is one thing I absolutely despise, it's when a game wastes my time. So basically my experience with Evoland was getting an interesting bit of nostalgia trip at the very beginning of the game, followed by immediately being reminded of why I absolutely despise JRPGs, followed by getting to the absolute worst part of the game, which is when it starts to emulate the PS1 era, when everything was loading from a disc that had painfully long load times, and it was that 3D aesthetic where the backgrounds were pre-rendered and the camera angles were obnoxious. And then finally it has to go and make things even worse by going from that directly into Diablo-esque gameplay, and that's another genre I can't stand. And much like with JRPGs, it's because that entire genre is designed to waste the player's time. And the thing that makes it so unbearable in Evoland is that all of these systems that they implement are the absolute bare bones form of those systems. There's nothing special about them, there's no unique abilities you can use during those sequences. I mean, the best you can really do during the JRPG-esque turn-based combat is you can attack or you can use a spell, and that's it. And then when you get to the Diablo-esque combat, the only thing you can do is a basic melee combo. And even the times when it does do the Zelda-esque combat, it's really not much better. I mean, you do get some additional abilities beyond simply whacking things with a sword, but you don't get those until fairly late in the game's progression, and by the time you get them, they're more or less an afterthought. So the game has you going back and forth between extremely bare-bones versions of mechanics that you've seen done way better in those older games that it's trying to emulate, although in the case of the Final Fantasy-esque combat, it was never good in the first place, so that's beside the point. And they don't have any cohesive vision for what genre they were really trying to follow along the way, because it tries to go through the history of action-adventure games, and then it just detours into JRPGs, then back to action-adventure, then back to JRPG, and then all of a sudden Diablo clone. Because clearly when they say that they're going through the history of action-adventure games, they're actually going through the history of action-adventure games as well as JRPGs, as well as Diablo clones. Because those three very separate genres, which have each gone along their own separate progressions, clearly have so much overlap that it makes sense to have them all mashed together in this one game that is supposedly going through the history of one genre. Here's the thing. You can clearly see from the very beginning that this was a game jam project. It was something where they put it together to have a cool proof of concept, and then when it came time to actually turn this into a full standalone game that they're actually selling for money, they didn't do enough additional development to really make it worth the asking price. Because don't get me wrong, the idea of a game going through the history of a particular genre and starting at the humble beginnings and going all the way up to the modern era is actually a really cool idea, and I would like to see it done well. The problem with Evoland is that they got so caught up in their nostalgia for certain genres that they didn't stop to think about whether or not it actually made any sense to include them, and thus you end up with a completely scatterbrained mess that has some good ideas in there, but ultimately just is completely lacking in execution. Maybe they hope that people's nostalgia for those old games will carry them through the entire experience, but here's the thing. Nostalgia is actually quite limited. It only really works in the context of the thing you are nostalgic for to begin with. And something doing an extremely bare-bones emulation of that thing is just not going to be able to hold up to scrutiny. So there you have it, folks, my thoughts on Evoland. It's a cool concept, but unfortunately the execution is severely lacking, and it doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. On a personal level, I went into it expecting it to be more action-adventure than JRPG, and it ended up being way more JRPG than it was action-adventure, which ended up being incredibly frustrating, because I can't stand that style of gameplay. And then they had to top everything off by throwing in a Diablo clone-esque segment towards the end of the game, which just ended up being so annoying that I just stopped playing entirely. Obviously your mileage may vary on that, but suffice to say, at absolute best, it's just a bit of a nostalgia trip, and if you're just looking for some nostalgia, honestly, I think you should just go back and play the games that you're nostalgic for to begin with. There's not really anything stopping you from doing so. If you're still interested in trying this out just for the sake of the concept, then I'll still have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up, but really you'd just be a lot better served by playing the games that this is trying to emulate. Thanks for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting games for review or equipment to help reviewing or whatever the case may be. If you can't or don't want to, then that's fine, I understand. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.